All right, let's get on to what you were alluding to, Saagar, which is this big question. All right, you bombed the hell out of Gaza. You killed all these civilians. You declared mission accomplished. What happens now? Now, the Biden administration has increasingly said two things. Number one, it would be a big mistake for Israel to reoccupy Gaza. And number two, they've recently been pushing this more aggressively. We think the Palestinian Authority should be the ones who are tasked with some, at least, of the governance of the Gaza Strip. In a new interview, Bibi goes ahead and rejects both of those things. Let's take a listen to what he has to say.
Gaza has to make sure that it's not a threat to Israel. We said destroy Hamas, and for that, if we want to have peace, we have to destroy Hamas. This is what Israel must do, and this is what Israel will do.
Would you accept an international force, Mr. Prime Minister? Would you accept an international force?
I think that the only force right now that can guarantee that Hamas, that terrorism does not reappear and take over Gaza again is the Israeli military. So overall military responsibility will have to be in Israel. As far as the civilian management of Gaza, we need to see the following two things. Gaza has to be demilitarized, and Gaza has to be de-radicalized. Mm-hmm. And I think so far, we haven't seen any Palestinian force, including the Palestinian Authority, that is able to do it. They teach their children to hate Israel. They're not fighting terrorists. They're paying for slay. That is, the more terrorists, Palestinian terrorists murder Jews, the more they get paid. And to this date, 36 days after the worst savagery perpetrated on the Jewish people since the Holocaust, the Palestinian Authority president refuses to condemn this savagery. So, we need a different authority. We need a different administration.
Who would that be? Who would that be, Mr. Prime Minister? Who would that be?
I think it's too early to say.
Okay.
Kirsten, I think it's too early to say, but I can say one thing. The first task we have to achieve is defeat Hamas. The first task the Allies had to achieve before they could reconstruct Germany was to defeat the Nazis.
So yet another World War II analogy there. I mean, listen, there are a lot of practical reasons why the Palestinian Authority is likely unable, it is very farcical to imagine that they could actually govern the Gaza Strip because they have no legitimacy in the West Bank, let alone in Gaza. So, they are rightly seen as collaborators with the Israeli security state and the IDF directly. So again, they're very weak. They have no legitimacy really in the West Bank. So imagining them in control of Gaza is pretty preposterous, but this is what the U.S. has been pushing. But of course, we know the real reason why Netanyahu is totally opposed to it is the same reason he's always been totally opposed to it, because he does not want some sort of union between the Palestinians of the West Bank and the Palestinians in Gaza, or any sort of a partner that you could reasonably negotiate with, because that would lead to question. All right, well, let's move forward with maybe a two-state solution. Let's move forward with some sort of a peace process. And he does not want that and has been very overt about it. So that's why he has always worked to keep the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza separate, and to prop up Hamas so that he can have this talking point of they're terrorists. You can't work with them. You can't negotiate. Of course we want peace, but we can't negotiate with these people.
Yeah, I think the biggest danger, actually, to the Israelis from the future perspective all lies within this. As I laid out, one of the big problems is going to be who is governing this. And if they don't accept the PA or any other actor that could legitimately lead, in the eyes of the West, to a Palestinian state, which they want to avoid, then they're going to find themselves almost perpetually in charge of the Gaza Strip. You found this quote, which I honestly find insane. Let's go and put this up there on the screen. Quote, "We are rolling out Nakba 2023, an Israeli minister says, on the northern Gaza Strip evacuation." This is the Likud minister Avi Dichter. He says that war is impossible to wage and there are masses between the tanks and the soldiers. Netanyahu does not support resettling the Gaza Strip. He says he will not give up security control over it under any circumstances. And he is not only a member of the Israeli security cabinet, but also the agricultural minister, a member of the Likud party. He should probably know better than to use terms like Gaza Nakba 2023, saying that that's how it's going to end. He's also a former director of the Shin Bet, which is, I guess, more analogous to our FBI here in the U.S. They are setting themselves up, really, I think, for a disastrous future. If they're going to commit to any sort of occupation or any sort of resettlement, they will find even their most exuberant supporters here in the West on the Democratic side are gone. And when you lose that and the support of the population, but even more importantly, I think, once again, they have still a tremendous amount of goodwill from what happened on October 7th. But this has become some sort of imperial and colonial project, then you really are going to completely lose any of that legitimacy in the eyes of even some of their, except your most ardent supporters. And I think the problem strategically for them is increasingly their current government has no ability to rein in these forces. I think they would be so much better off with a better coalition type government, which is entirely focused on the military strategic question of destruction of Hamas and not pairing it almost overwhelmingly with these colonial ambition, with the refusal to condemn settler violence in the West Bank, with the refusal to silence people like this. I mean, it's just one of those where we were very careful. If you know, Netanyahu likes to talk about World War II. We were extraordinarily careful to demand unconditional surrender, but also not to telegraph any sort of like inflammatory no, I'm saying the West, not the Russians. They talked about things a little bit differently. But at least on our end, we wanted to minimize like civilian German resistance at the same time of making clear that we demand the unconditional surrender of the Nazi regime. And by separating those two questions is actually, I think, a smarter play than the way that they are currently going about it. I also don't think it's a particularly useful one because it's like, well, you know, how did that end up in terms of Germany? We ended up occupying, we still have one of the largest bases in the world in Germany and in Japan. It's like, so is that what you're committing to, a 75-year presence in the region? Because that's insane. Any of these needs to end with some sort of political resolution. But again, they don't really want to talk about the legitimacy of that. And I think the single biggest threat to the Israel, the nation state right now, is this faction of the party and the Netanyahu government, which finds itself in a position where the longer the war goes on, the better off it is for him. Every interview he gives, including this one, they're like, hey, what about you? Did you fail? And he's like, we'll talk about that later. It's also historically ridiculous. I went back and was looking at this. In 2006, Netanyahu demanded that the prime minister of Israel at that time take immediate responsibility for what happened in the 2006 Lebanon, which was a disaster. So a little bit of history checking what he's doing.
Yeah, I mean, so Netanyahu's party is Likud. This dude who said, hey, yeah, Nakba 2023, Gaza Nakba 2023, that's how it'll end, is a Likud minister. He's the agriculture minister. He's also a member, as Saagar said, of the security cabinet. So it's not like this is a fringe view. This is the view of Netanyahu's party. Certainly, they are very upfront about it. That some of the extremist coalition partners who he insisted remain in the unity security government during the war cabinet. So, this is the mainstream view of the people who are running the government. And let's be honest, it's the mainstream view of a lot of Israeli citizens as well. It's not like there's huge internal backlash to, this dude coming out and being like, yeah, Gaza Nakba. Which the other thing just historically that is worth noting here too is that Israelis long denied that there even was a Nakba. Their story for decades, which has become sort of impossible to maintain given the revelations of historical documents, but which nonetheless they've been sort of committed to, was like, no, we didn't push people out. They left, their leaders told them to leave and they just left. There was no violence. There was no, displacement. They just willingly went. And so they've always denied the idea that there even was an original Nakba. So I guess we're now like openly admitting that as well. But again, this is very consistent with that Israeli ministry report that came out and said our ideal solution is ethnic cleansing, pushing all of these people out of Gaza and forcing Egypt, compelling Egypt to take them in and resettle them. And so, when you've got a member of the security cabinet and former Shin Bet director saying these things openly, you should take note. You had the Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is, again, one of the most extreme elements of the Netanyahu government, saying, quote, "To be clear, when we say that Hamas should be destroyed, it also means those who celebrate, those who support, and those who hand out candy. They are all terrorists, and they should also be destroyed." So again, laying out that, even people who weren't involved in October 7th, who just, maybe expressed some sort of support for Hamas or, just exist in Gaza and, are Palestinian, that they are also terrorists and they should be destroyed, which is part of why there needs to be a lot of hard questions asked about, when you say Hamas should be destroyed, what exactly do you mean by that? Because that is actually, in reality, a very, very squishy and very potentially, large-scale concept. Who is Hamas? And when you see the Israeli government going and being like, actually, UN workers are also Hamas, you can see how broad their definition of who qualifies as Hamas actually is.
Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. It was making the rounds. It was actually a pretty interesting interview.
It was very interesting.
From The New Yorker by Isaac Choitner. He's kind of famous for doing these barbed interviews with unsuspecting victims. And in this one, it was the quote, "The extreme ambitions of West Bank settlers." And he interviews a woman who is a West Bank settler and activist, and asked her about her vision for a Jewish state. This is Daniela Wise. She's one of the biggest leaders in the settlement community, has been involved in settlement politics ever since the 1967 war, and has been living in the region since after that war. So it's been a long time, suffice it to say. What exactly did she say, which everyone found very noteworthy? Well, there's one particular quote which I think really put everything into perspective, which was, quote, "In Israel, there's a lot of support for settlements. This is why there's been right-wing governments for so many years. The world, especially the United States, thinks there's an option for a Palestinian state. If we continue to build communities, then we will block the option for a Palestinian state. We want to close the option for a Palestinian state, and the world wants to leave that option open. It is a very simple thing to understand."
It is indeed, isn't it?
Yeah, she says, quote, "Settlement is the way to return to Zion." She says, yes, it's the dispersion, the beginning of the revival of a Jewish nation. What are the borders of the Jewish nation? The borders of the homeland of the Jews are the Euphrates in the east and the Nile in the southwest. Palestinians sometimes use that slogan. They're talking about river to the sea. What you're saying is also about this in relation to a Jewish homeland. She says, quote, "Of course, if someone wants to invent a new religion today, who will decide the rules? The first nation that got the word from God, the promise of God, then follow that others, Christianity and Islam, with their demands and their perceptions, so they are just imitating what existed already. So why in Israel they would be anywhere in the world? They came after us in a double sense of the word." So anyway, I think she lays out pretty plainly what some of the what a pretty sizable coalition of people in Israel do believe in and support. And as I said, I think it is probably the single biggest threat to Israel in the future, just given the sensitive nature of that. And also really just where our interests in terms of diplomatic resolution and theirs diverge on an almost completely different plane, and have been for a long time, if we're also being honest.
Well, and also how we have the politicians in this country have long maintained this fiction of like, oh, working on the two-state solution. I actually appreciate, and I'm horrified by, but appreciate the candor here of like, yeah, that's the settlement project. That's why it's popular in Israel. That's why it's been going on while all of these, potential peace deal negotiations, et cetera, were going on. The settlement building never stopped, even though it's clear violation of international law. That's why, you've had this while this war is ongoing. You've had this incredible escalation in violence and pushing Palestinians off of their land in the West Bank. And it's not just that the government is silent about it. It's that the IDF is actually directly involved in more than half of these incidents of Jewish settler violence against Palestinians and efforts to push them off of their land. So this is an overt government project. It's really not a secret. In Israel, again, you could talk to people like Daniela Weiss and she'll tell you flat out what's going on here. But, you also, when this is something we flagged from the beginning, like you see the rhetoric when Bibi goes on with Kristen Welker, very different than when he's speaking in Hebrew to Israelis, where these sorts of things are much clearer and much more naked and, very widely supported by the public. Israel, interestingly, is one of the only countries, I think developed countries in the world, where the younger population is actually more right-wing and more radical than the older population that still has some connection to that previous labor Zionism and social democratic state. And so this has been the trend in Israeli politics for a long time. And there are a lot of people who are looking at this moment, and a lot of people with power in the government, up to and likely including Netanyahu, who say this might be our chance to once and for all be able to, quote unquote, solve the Palestinian problem, especially in Gaza. And, you know, they're coming out and saying it. So when you see American leaders being very precious about, you know, their plans and ethnic cleansing and these sorts of things, like, they just come out and say it, and then we're supposed to pretend like this isn't going on and this isn't what the goal ultimately is.
It's a big problem.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.